why don't we define what is oxalate, and also talk about like why plants have it, and understand that plants need this compound for their own benefit. And as entitled human beings that we are, guess what? Plants are not around for us to eat and destroy them and kill their babies and make them not procreate. They want to take over the world just like everything else. Can you talk about why plants use oxalate and what uses it has?
Yeah, I sure can. Because the thing is, I do have to laugh when people think that, plants somehow want to be eaten. That's not how it works. Plants want to defend themselves from predation to some extent as well, right? Although it may be useful for their fruits to be eaten by certain creatures, because like birds might eat fruits, but that distributes seeds, right?
Yep.
Doesn't mean they want their structure eaten, because how do they produce the seed if they're being eaten, right? So I'll use spinach as an example, just because it's such a clear example. So in spinach, you have a plant using oxalate for more than one purpose. So plants use oxalate in part to be able to draw minerals up into their structure. So oxalate is biochemically a mineral chelator. So it will bind with minerals, and in some cases it'll create quite an insoluble bond. Your calcium oxalate kidney stone is an example of how good insoluble bonds work, because that'll mean that stuff precipitates out into your urine because it's insoluble and it's going to tend to come together. It can also work with other minerals though too. Oxalate has a whole list of what I call preferred dance partners, and that would be most of your double positive mineral ions. So if you're thinking magnesium, to some extent iron, zinc, copper, like lots of minerals that we actually need to have in our system can be potential targets of the chelation action from oxalate. So that's one thing that oxalate does. And plants use that. Plants use that to get minerals in. Plants may also be using oxalate, and even in its crystalline form, to support things like photosynthesis. So they're not only building it into their structure in one way or another, but they're using it, I'm going to say metabolically, but like for their function, so to allow them to do their work more efficiently, right? But the other way that plants can use oxalate is as a defense against predation. And so your question was kind of leading into this part. Defense against predation, who's most likely a plant's greatest nemesis? Well, it's actually an insect.
Right.
And so if you have something like spinach and you have those nice tender looking leaves, if you've ever grown spinach, and back in the day I have, spinach doesn't tend to get eaten much by insects. They'll nibble at it. Sometimes you'll get some insects who can really handle spinach, but by and large, spinach doesn't need a lot of, pesticides and stuff on it. And mostly that's because it's got so much oxalate in there, and so much of it is crystalline and insoluble oxalate, that spinach can actually damage the mouth of the insect that's trying to eat it. And that would also apply to rhubarb plants. I mean, back in the day when I was growing up, almost everybody I knew had a backyard rhubarb plant. Well, those leaves looked pretty pristine, and that's partially because they're not nutritious. They're more poisonous than they are beneficial.
Wow.
And so plants can be using this to prevent insects from being able to eat them. It's a really effective defense. If the insect can no longer chew because its mouth has been all broken up by these crystals, well, that's the end of the game for the insect, and certainly the plant wins.
Wow. So I've never made that connection before. That makes a lot of sense. I'm thinking about Lear Keith. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Lear Keith. She's the author of The Vegetarian Myth.
Yes.
And she has a hilarious, I never get sick of this story, hilarious story where she was trying to grow cabbage, I believe, in her garden. And the snails would always eat it. So she tried all these crazy different ways to not harm the snails and to save the cabbage. And I'm pretty sure that cabbage is lower oxalate. Is that why they would go
It's
to that?
very low oxalate. So
Wow.
slugs love it.
Okay. Wow.
They
I've
love
never
it.
made that connection. Wow.
And one of the things that actually helps with keeping them away from, like keeping the slugs away from something, is diatomaceous earth. And why would that work? You've got all these crystals. It's not nice to them. It damages their skin as they're trying to get over it. So essentially, those kinds of crystals are embedded in the spinach, right? But they're not in cabbage. Cabbage is actually, I think one of our best choices in terms of a vegetable if you're going to eat it. Low in carbs, high in nutrients, good sulfur, all kinds of things to recommend cabbage, and very low oxalate, very low.
Wow, so interesting. So we around here, we follow a carnivore diet. So we've eliminated a lot of plant foods, but I am making right now a batch of kimchi, which is made out of cabbage as well. Is that why we ferment cabbage and not why we ferment things like spinach?
Well, I think spinach is probably, there's more than one reason why you wouldn't ferment it. I mean, it wilts to nothing, right?
And it's gross.
Yeah, that too. But so cabbage has got more structure that allows you to do something like fermentation and still have a palatable texture at the other end. But, I think traditionally a lot of the high oxalate foods were prepared in certain ways. And that's another thing. As we've gotten, to the modern day, we decided, oh, well, all those people in the past, they boiled things, but boiling's nasty because then we lose nutrients into the water. So we have to eat things raw. Well, if you boil spinach, you can lose 35 to 40% of the oxalate that's in there. Still too high. Don't eat it. But but if you were only having it once a year and it was only harvested for 2 or 3 weeks of that year, then a little bit of spinach might not have killed you, especially if you were boiling it. And oh, by the way, people tended to eat it with a cream sauce, which would have provided calcium. And so if you had soluble oxalate available that you would be more freely absorbing, binding with minerals can help. Not a get out of jail free card, but it can help. So, which kind of leads me into the fact that there's more than one kind of oxalate, but let me finish the idea of how we cook things. So there's lots of traditional ways of preparing foods, which would have by default reduced oxalate. So pickled beets, they sit in that pickling liquid. They sit there for a long time before you eat them. You can be dropping, again, a third or more of the oxalate there. And if you're only eating it as a condiment, you might get away with it. It depends on what your throughput is in terms of excretion. But yeah, then we decided, oh, well, we can grate raw beets and we can put them in a salad. So traditional cooking and preparation would have made a difference. And that leads us into this soluble versus insoluble. So crystalline oxalate is insoluble oxalate. When you eat that, you are going to be less likely to absorb it. But let's stop and think about sandpaper running its way through the inside.
Yeah.
Not a good idea, right? So leaky gut's almost epidemic now. Could that have something to do with the fact that we've upped our oxalate? Right? But the other kind of oxalate is the soluble oxalate. This is the oxalate ion, unbound to a mineral, which can be freely absorbed into our system. It'll be moved by passive transport, which means all you need is a concentration gradient between the gut and the bloodstream, and you're off to the races, right? So, when people think, oh, if I fix my leaky gut and I have, you know, a really strong, healthy gut lining, I'll be fine. No, you won't, because this thing doesn't care if your gut lining's strong and good or not. And at the same time as those things are true, we also have discovered antibiotics, which has been the boon to the 20th century. People who would have died have lived, and thank God for antibiotics. But the kinds of gut bacteria that tend to break down oxalate are very fragile in the face of antibiotics. And like, while many of the gut bacteria species may have some capacity to use oxalate as fuel, our big gun in the space is called Oxalobacter formigenes, and there'll be no pronunciation test at the end of our.
I didn't have to read that in the introduction. Salicylate was hard enough.
Yeah, Oxalobacter formigenes. And the thing about Oxalobacter is that it eats oxalate first and only. So it's an obligate oxalate degrading bacteria. But that one will be killed off really easily and really quickly by antibiotics. So we don't have the right gut bacteria. We don't process foods like we used to. We eat extremely high levels of it. And so, you know, our nutritional advice tells us if you don't feel good, eat more of these things.
That's right.
Eat more almonds, eat more spinach, eat, right? And so it's like a perfect storm. And how many people do you know who have had to ultimately go to something like carnivore or go to something like keto? And if you do keto right, you're going to inadvertently drop your oxalate. And that's been a fix for them. So for me, I wasn't doing keto right. And I had to go the next level because I was using, you know, almond flour and blah, blah, blah. But
such a great point.
Such
a great point.
There's all these people out there who are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to follow the good advice. But I do think that one of the reasons why carnivore may be taking off is because that's a diet where you essentially drop your oxalate to zero or as close to zero as you're ever going to get. And then all of a sudden, this poison, like, keep in mind, big enough dose, this sucker can kill you. Okay. I don't know how high you'd have to go on salicylate or histamine to kill yourself, right? I mean, we can kill ourselves with oxalate at dietary levels. We can do damage, big damage at dietary levels. There's lots of interesting case studies on PubMed. And so what are we doing to ourselves in this environment where we're trying to do the right thing? Chronic inflammation is taking off. Anti-inflammatory diets are telling you eat more spinach, eat more almonds, eat more, and people are just trying to do the right thing. I think, I think it is a perfect storm.